learn about photography from a non-photographer has come through this collaboration over the last 2.5 years that I've had with Chris Reed and Stas Landscape Urbanism. Chris and I are working on a book project together. And I have to tell this kind of embarrassing and funny story about the beginning of this collaboration.
Uh-oh.
And when actually the first person to reach out to me, who's also on this call right now, is Scott Mitchell. But initially it was just kind of an email, and it was kind of this brief description of, we want to make a book. We're a landscape architecture firm. We do work in all these different cities. And as someone who lives and works in like a kind of a small market, I'm pretty used to getting these inquiries that are just kind of outside of what I actually do. So I'm just get into this mode of like, yeah, this isn't really what I do. So I kind of explain, like, there's people who specialize in architectural photography and landscape photography, and you probably want one of those people to make your book. And the reason that's really funny to me now, and you guys will understand more as this conversation goes on, is these two people, Chris and Scott, couldn't get it more. They are extremely knowledgeable about photography and about how it relates to what they do. And it was very much me who didn't get it rather than them. It was me not understanding what they do, not them not understanding what I do. And it actually took a while into our collaboration before I think I really understood that they really did want me to do my own thing and actually approach it as I would a personal project. But anyway, I want to. I thought of Chris kind of right away when I came up with this idea for Between Us, because the collaboration I've had with him has been a really interesting and profound experience for me. But the tricky question was who to pair Chris with. And on the one hand, there's so many photographers who make urban work that does focus on kind of this pulled back lay of the land kind of observations that would pair really nicely with the knowledge base that Chris brings. But I actually ended up asking Ben Rasmussen, who was one of my first guests on this show, and has also been a collaborator with Chris and I on this book as an editor. And so since he understood what Chris does, I decided to ask him his thoughts, and he suggested Michelle Groskopf. And I think her work is actually a perfect pairing for a conversation with Chris, in that it's not a super obvious relationship. Michelle's work is about immersion. It's about identity. It's about this tactile quality of the fabric of the people that make up the places that we inhabit. And I think that crossover between what she does and what Chris does, although it's less obvious, it kind of points to what makes Chris special as an architect, is that he's interested in these moments that unfold that he's setting the stage for in his design practice. So just some quick introductions. Michelle Groskopf is an editorial and street photographer living in Los Angeles. And you don't even have a bio on your site, which I think is awesome, actually. So I'm just going to kind of say what I know of you. She's worked for a really wide array of editorial clients, including Wired and Vanity Fair and New York Times, and has had this long ongoing practice of street work as a kind of her personal practice, which I think is mostly what we'll be talking about. Chris Reed, the founding director of Stas Landscape Urbanism for the last 2 decades, and is a Harvard professor of graduate studies. And he works at so many different scales, designing our experience in the urban landscape. And that can range from like small parks that are kind of off the beaten path to, I would say probably the biggest project is what is it, like a 20-mile greenway through St. Louis, 20-ish mile greenway that my words, not his, but I think will really change the way that people interact with that city and get around the city. And it's such a complex project, and I'm excited to talk to him about that. So thank you both for joining us. I wanted to bring you both together because as photographers, we consider researching people and histories sometimes that are relevant to projects that we do, but I thought it might be interesting to think about the origin of the spaces themselves. You know, the world is like a stage for photographers to observe and react to. Who set that stage? And for us to understand that, I think it'll be helpful to start to understand the moments that unfold within those scenes. So another reason, actually, the two of you were chosen in particular is LA is like this common denominator between both of you. Chris, you live in Boston, but you wish you lived in LA.
True.
Chris told me once that he brought his family to visit LA, hoping they would fall in love with it and want to move there. And I think he almost disowned them because they weren't properly impressed. So this is a question that just kind of loft out to either of you. And Michelle, you actually, you told me you moved to LA from New York, and it was kind of like the only other place. So as someone who lives in the rural country, I certainly don't think of New York and LA as the only two places. But what is it for either of you about LA that feels particularly special?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I've been all over the country, and there's so many places I love. But as far as like somewhere where I could imagine myself living after New York, for me, it just was an easy fit with LA because of the work that I was doing at the time. And I think it's a really mysterious city. And that's something that I wanted to change when I left New York. I needed some mystery, and New York gives itself to you constantly. There's not a lot of digging you have to do. It's constantly coming at you. And LA, for me, if you don't make your way around the city, then you don't get to know the city. And if you, depending on what route you take or how you get around the city, also defines your life here, I think. And that was really a big part of the reason why I came here, I think, just to stir that in myself again.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for me, LA is so much the kind of city that I don't know and didn't grow up in, right? I grew up in New England, not so far from Boston and Providence. I've been living in Boston for a long time, lived in Philadelphia, but LA is a completely different kind of animal in so many ways, right? From the standpoint of scale, of density, of lifestyle, of landscape, of climate, of environment. I mean, for one thing, it's warm. Whereas Boston has these lovely seasons, but you actually have to weather through February and March and live through all that, and then have April where it still snows occasionally. It's LA for me has this exuberance to it that I think has appealed to a lot of people going back in history. It's kind of what LA marketed: warm sunshine, beaches, hills, beautiful environment, beautiful place. It's matured in the last decade or two in quite different ways. It's growing up, and with that has its own growing pains. And so you see glimpses of opportunity. I mean, I'm interested in LA professionally as well, because it's kind of rediscovering the public realm and the potential for open space and walking. I know Michelle's been walking around and exploring, and there are more people doing this lately. And so I also see professional opportunity there in a way where folks are discovering something that other cities have discovered in the past, but LA is going to do it in a different way because inherently it's just a different kind of city.
Yeah, and go ahead, Michelle.
I was just gonna say, yeah, there's so many different ways to live here. That's what makes it amazing. There's like a little bit of something for everybody,
Yeah.
and like it's huge and vast and full of all kinds of people and all kinds of literally ways to live, whether economically, through your career, and then physically, whether you're by the mountains, by the ocean, in the middle like I am,
Hmm.
if you're outside, if you're in the density of it, and it's just got a lot to offer space
Yeah.
wise. Yeah.
So within, I think, either photography or landscape architecture, a lot of what we do is kind of problem solving in a way. Everything's kind of a problem, and we find a way to visually solve it, or through design. So with LA, what are the problems? Like, so Chris, for example, like, you're kind of responding to certain environmental conditions, certain social conditions. Like, what do you see as the things that you're kind of trying to solve as if you're working in LA?
Yeah, so a number of them. I mean, climate right now is critical. LA, people have known, is a city built within an arid environment that doesn't have the resources it needs for a city of that size to survive. So it actually, between energy, food, and water, it reaches out to half a continent to bring in resources from other places to be able to just persist.
Mhm.
And so there is this oddity of the city that shouldn't even be there, right? And the extended footprint. So I think the ways in which people live within the city, the ways in which resources can be thought of and dealt with. So there is water in LA. It's just flushed out to sea through concrete channels as quickly as possible. So even the resources that are there aren't well utilized. So how do we, in a lot of ways, our work is thinking through how do we physically retool the city? How do we capture water as opposed to flushing it away? How do we do that within multifunctional landscapes and urban spaces? And also, how do we address some of the serious social issues that are ongoing? It surprised me when I came back to LA 8 or 10 years ago how prevalent the housing crisis is there. I had assumed that housing was cheap. I was wrong. There's a huge, huge homeless issue. There's a huge, despite the economic boom of the last decade, there's a huge housing crisis without a lot of affordable housing for people. So how is it, we work on cities as well, and how do we think about advocating for the right public policy and putting together proposals for urban districts that really address the full range of urban residents, and in particular recognizing underserved and vulnerable populations. That includes the homeless, but it also includes racial and social minorities and economic minorities as well, and how we allow those populations to have access to the same kinds of open space amenities, public health amenities that any of the other privileged among us do as well.
Mm-hmm.
Another small issue, which a lot of people, maybe unless you live here, don't think about, is shade. Like, especially now, the summer months coming, like the disparity between, like, especially when you consider walking or having to take the bus, you're standing outside, there's no shade in poor neighborhoods. And that's a real issue. It's hot. You're like outside, and it keeps people from going outside and from like really utilizing public spaces, because they're just like these like open spaces where you just get sunburn or you get sick. And shade is really important. Rich people get shade, whenever you're looking for one of those tree-lined streets or the big palms and etc. It's a wealthy neighborhood, and it's something that's really interesting when you start. I go around the city a lot, and you really can feel the heat difference.
Yeah. So, as a photographer, are there specific LA challenges? I mean, you've photographed a lot of other places. Are there things, especially in street photography, that make LA more difficult to shoot?
Um, Honestly, no. Like, but I'm somebody that really appreciates isolation in
Yeah.
subject matter, because I get close, and so um, I I make it work. I think
Hmm.
that's when it like the challenge becomes then the thing that like drives me. It's like, where are the people? Okay, I have to go find the people. And in every
Yeah.
township in Los Angeles, you have a street that's like the high street, and so you go to the high street, and then, what happens when you get off the high street? What does that look like? Well,
Hmm.
you'll still find people around, and it's kind of I think, a myth that people aren't out. I find them. I love
Yeah.
them. The people that aren't in their cars are the most special of people, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really great. Yeah. And the light is perfect here, so yeah.
So,
Can't complain.
and your images to me just feel so LA. There's something about the
Uh-huh.
poppiness, the color, the light, and everything about it. It just seems like there's this relationship between the cultural identity of LA and the visual language that you're using to represent that place.
Mm,
Um, so
yeah.
is that kind of an intentional? Does it feel like a collaboration between you and this place to make an aesthetic, or is it just that that's your aesthetic and you happen to find a place that is a good fit for it?
I think it's a little bit of both, but
Hmm.
the city definitely, like, I can see, like, on screen a tiny little bit of something, and it's LA because of the
Yeah.
style of building, the colors of the city. There's the quality of light. It's very specific, just the amount of sky versus building and etc. I think it's a huge muse for me, and it really taught me to see, patterns and light and the colors in a city, and use that to kind of bring out the subject matter. Um, I'm not really big on contacts with my street photography, so I like to think that I could shoot anywhere, and I've shot so many places, from like rural areas to Seoul, Korea, to
Hmm.
wherever. And I think you often know that it's my work just based on like the proximity and the colors and the flash and whatnot. But
Yeah.
LA has a feeling, it has a vibe, and yeah, and it's also reflected in the people that are living here, how they present themselves. Um, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's
Is there
LA.
a yeah, is there an equivalent there with what you do, Chris? Like as far as the cultural identity of a place, and how that relates to how you react to designing in that specific place, and does that feel like a sort of a back and forth collaboration? And are there ever cases where the location and your vision don't really align, and it's harder to work in certain places?
Well, so to the first question, yeah, there is. For us, it's about embedding ourselves within a place and really beginning to understand what a place is about. What is the platform that we're working from? What is the stage, in the words of the book? What is the stage that has been set for
Hmm.
us? What's already in play? Now we look at that broadly. We look at that environmentally, as landscape architects, in terms of climate, environment, water, no water. How does that ecosystem work? We look at that from an urban perspective, from a social perspective, from a cultural perspective.
Hmm.
And so we're doing that first. And in fact, so much of the work that you were doing with us is helping to capture a lot of what we see through your eyes in this case. But what is it that we see that's in play in a place before we even get there, right?
Hmm.
We, as designers, we certainly have interests of our own that are distinct to what we do and what we bring to a place,
Hmm.
but they always respond in some ways to the stage that's been set.
Yeah.
We hope that through the work we do, we then renovate a place and allow it to give life to that space, to give new life to that space in ways that both respond to what came before us, but create a new life.
Hmm.
And so we're always thinking about not just the foundations, but then how do we transform a space in a way that allows water environmental dynamics to be engaged in meaningful ways? How is it that we set up spaces to take on new forms of social life within a space? And so for us, I can't imagine just going into a place, not understanding anything about it and imposing a design idea. It's almost impossible from a landscape standpoint because everything we do is by nature tied to the environment and the physical condition around us, right? So it's always about that blend of our own sensibilities, what we learn and see about a place, and how that can be put together and constructed anew in a lot of ways to sometimes subtly, but other times more dramatically transform the way in which a place works.
I have a question for Chris. Chris, if I open up this conversation with the notion that LA is very mysterious. I think most people, I live in the middle of Hollywood, so I think it's quite gritty, but this is something quite charming about it. And LA has kind of always been the sort of gritty place. What sort of conversation would you and your team have if you were given the resources and the space to create something here that would, do you discuss about, okay, what are the features of LA that people like? What's the mythology of LA? How do we keep that? If you were to come in from Boston, and Boston's a very different city, with ideas on bringing people together, is that a manicured space? Is that, how do you keep that rawness of LA? That would be a concern that I would have as a person.
No, absolutely. No, totally. And that's something that in a way our work strives to walk that line between something that's new and introduced. But if we're working within a gritty place, how does the grittiness continue to be there? And I actually think that distinguishes our work a little bit. We're okay with the grit, and it kind of goes back to why I invited Mike to do the project with us, because Mike's a photojournalist, as you know. He's not a design photographer. There are plenty of design photographers that can make your project look pristine, and perfect and well composed and well illuminated and all that. And in a sense, I knew Mike was going to take beautiful photographs, but they're exposing a different side. They're exposing the real life to the place and the real life of the project. And that's kind of what we wanted to put across in the book. We don't have control over so much of what happens after we leave a project, right? We're setting the stage for a few things that we know will happen, but we don't have full control over that. So the more ways that a project can engage with that grittiness or whatever that particular environment is. And I would say I can't answer the question for all of LA because LA is so geographically expansive and so different. So, there are portions of mid LA where, you're going down these streets and it just looks like the same thing over and over and over again. It can be a warehouse or a garage repair shop, and then all of a sudden you pop into the most amazing gallery or most amazing cocktail bar, right? And the facade is the same. You would never know that thing is hiding in plain sight, right? But it still exists within this gritty environment. The approach that we take to a project there is quite different than approach we take to a project in Santa Monica, say, or on the east side somewhere. I just finished a studio project at school where I asked students to look at the Santa Monica airport, 227 acres that's scheduled to be closed and converted to a park in the next 8 to 10 years. What would you do there? And there are some people that say, well, Santa Monica's park rich. They don't need any more parks. On the other hand, it sits right at the corner of Santa Monica, adjacent to and overlapping into West LA, and it's 227 acres. It operates more regionally than a local park would. And so some of the questions we were asking was, what other functions could this park serve? Could there be a nursery function, for instance, that address just the issue that you brought to the table of lack of shade? What if the park was in fact a working nursery that produced trees that were then distributed throughout the city of LA and Santa
That would be
Monica,
awesome.
right, to bring new shade to places that really need shade, and also, frankly, to replace that generation of tall palm trees that's about to die off because of the lifespan. And by the way, those palm trees bring very little shade
Right.
to begin with. So we might take on different aspects of the site. Even in that case, as we were working with the students, there was something about the airport itself that remained to different degrees within each of the students' projects, which was also really nice. Like, it never erased its starting point. It was always this built-in memory of what that place was for so long, but was transformed into different degrees. And I think that's the kind of approach that we take no matter which part of LA that we're working in. I've always been fascinated with the large-scale hunky infrastructure of LA, the LA River, the highways, all that kind of stuff. And for us, it's always a question not to erase that, but how can we create something that functions more environmentally healthy, more socially healthy, more robust, but still maintain some of that real kind of rawness and hunkiness, right? We don't want to import New York to or San Francisco to LA. We want something to emerge that's specific to this place.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
I'd love to start looking at some images. Michelle, would you like to pull up some of the recent COVID stuff, and that can be a segue into.
Sure. Or how about I show some? I think maybe it's better if I show
context
some
first.
Yeah,
you're
so
right.
you can see,
You're right.
like.
Yes. Good call. Okay, so.
So this is I've been doing these 3-part photos of people. This is the Record Peddler. It's actually a really funny record store. It's an amazing jazz record store and classical music record store on Melrose, I believe. Yes. And the owner, this is his assistant, is this like kind of very old-fashioned man that wants to stop all modern technology. He's really fun to talk to. So I just literally travel around, and I find that like my work for me is more of it's more of like an autobiography. It's a journal. It's like a daily journal of things that I see while I walk around Los Angeles. And for me, they all have very big LA vibe. Yeah, I mean, I got very close. I love details, intimacy. I'm actually quite curious, Chris, about how you feel about the intersection of public and private. This is something that like keeps me up at night as street photography becomes more and more vilified, and this like notion of privacy in public spaces becomes like this battleground. I'm always curious about that. Other people outside of like I have a need to photograph this stuff. It's like a compulsion of mine. I want to keep being able to do it. I hope I continue to have the legal right to do it. But like all the time people are fighting on that. Yeah, I'm curious how you think about that. I could stop. Like, just tell me when to stop.
No,
through.
I'd love to keep looking. Wow, that was amazing.
Yeah, I shoot the farmer's market a lot.
These are great because what you're looking at are like the dirt in somebody's fingernail, or a wrinkle, or the skin. I mean, the skin so much is prevalent in each of these. And even when you have a detail of a hand, I can't help but look at what's behind that hand as well.
Right.
To try to get a sense of the setting.
I try and squeeze it out of you.
Yeah. Right,
But
right.
this is a very LA photo. This is a girl who had just competed in a volleyball competition in Santa Monica, and she's icing her hand right
Ah,
after, you know.
ah.
And this is like he is really funny, very sage-like homeless man in Venice Beach.
That's awesome.
You know, yeah. So I just walk around, and for me right now, like this whole COVID lockdown has put a full stop on my work, pretty much the kind of
Yeah.
work that I like to make. And I realized just how important public space is to my own way of navigating the world creatively. Um, you know, this is stuff that now I long for to be able to make again. Like I isolate people, but this is in a crowd of people every time, you know. And you know, to take away public, but then also, and I wanted to talk to you about this, Chris, too, is this like LA right now, outside of like, you know, the health doom and gloom and the obviously economic doom and gloom, which we'll be feeling for a long time. LA is having a beautiful moment with respect to people in public spaces. Like, you know, we're all trapped inside, but because it's big, we're able to like go for walks, etc. So you really are seeing tons of people walking. You're seeing tons of people ride bikes. Like bikes are sold out all over the city. Families are getting on their like bikes and going. And like, I've just been thinking so much about like how much more positive the city becomes when you have that kind of interaction, and how like you see people smiling and we're all smiling at each other while we ride our bikes. And it's like a completely different way to experience the city, because you're on the ground and you see the textures, you see all the wonderful like houses and gardens and people and, you know, the buildings and the light and everything. You're like, I'm not the only one wandering around now. It's everybody's kind of like making their way, and it makes the city so much more vibrant and tolerable and clean and environmentally. And I'm curious if
No, it's amazing. We see a little bit of that in Boston, where some streets are being shut down to give more space to people, and that's happening both alongside linear parks and beachfronts, for instance, but it's also happening within commercial centers, just to give people more space to move, and because there aren't as many cars. I mean, that's what occurred to me. If I were in LA right now, I'd be riding my bike like you wouldn't believe, because it's probably the safest moment that the city's ever seen. You know, there's a book that I started reading this winter called Sidewalking by David Ulin. And it's all about him prior to COVID, starting walks around his neighborhood and essentially telling his own version of a history of LA through the eyes of what he sees as he's walking around. So it's brilliant. He's a bit of a journalist, right? And it's very personal, but it's also telling the story of a city through eyes and through starting points that are often not at all typical for a city like LA. So it's a fascinating book, but we're seeing this in a number of places, and I think there are hints of some of this rediscovering. I mean, that's what's interesting in LA. There was already, you know, probably starting 20 years ago, a renaissance in terms of the arts and culture, a real rebirth that you could feel, that then eventually started to translate itself into public spaces. So what is it? Grant Park at City Hall, Pongfa Park in Santa Monica, and a number of others. And just this whole sense that, yeah, you could have street life in particular places like downtown. That it was possible to be a human being wandering around the city. The fact that the city and state are investing so much in public transit infrastructure is amazing, and unlike many other places. But you know, there's this pent up demand for these services. I think LA is at a very unique point, and I'm curious to see the ways in which this pandemic will change behavior. I mean, at a certain point, all cities are going to have to reckon with the question of, do we take the streets back now from the pedestrians that we pivoted over to, right? And what sort of transformations are in store as we look forward. So many of us are hoping actually that this really causes cities to say, hey, you know, it's going to be a slow reboot anyway. Why can't we start to factor in changes in lifestyle and changes in the way in which streets are thought of as we do it?
I read somewhere that Paris is doing that they're like post-lockdown, they're going to issue more bike paths and create more bike paths because there is just such a love of the experience.
And it happened a few years back in the middle of Times Square, right?
Totally.
It started on a temporary basis, and people were all upset, and there was a big uproar. And then they finally did it on a permanent basis, and really redesigned the space for people. And the city still works, right?
Yeah.
So if this does have like a long-term effect on the psyche of the country or the world, really, but it kind of seems like, just from my outside perspective, looking at what both of you do, that Michelle, that would be kind of a negative for you, maybe, because it'd make it harder for you to interact publicly. But it sounds like I'm hearing, Chris, from you, that it would be like a move in a positive direction. So could each of you speak to, you know, looking forward, this shift in the psyche? Is this going to last? If, you know, projecting as if it is going to be more of a long-term shift, how's that going to affect your ability to do what you do?
I'll always find a way, I suppose. You get desperate enough. I started using, you know, I'm used to using a smaller lens, and now I'm literally walking around with a 70 to 200. It's very heavy. You know, there's always a tool, and if there isn't a tool now, somebody will create it for the, you know, for the new world photography, I suppose. But yeah, this kind of like, I need crowds. I need people on the street. I need to be able to get up close to people to do what I do. And also I just long for it. I love crowds. I'm like a pretty reclusive person. I come home after working, whether it's for editorial or for myself, and I just like veg out and I play video games or whatever. But, you know, when I step outside with the intention of having a really great day of photography, it's the crowds that I go and drive to. And without them, I don't know what it means for street photography. I don't know what it means for my personal work. I would have to really rethink my vision, and hopefully it would be something organic. I don't know, but I'm getting bored of photographing just plants all the time. You know, it's hard for me. So.
I mean, for me, it's a little different. It's more of an adjustment because I mean, as we're designing a landscape or a park or a garden, we're designing it on the one hand for people to gather, and often for there to be events and activities of various sizes and scales to happen. But we're also designing it for quiet moments and solitary moments and moments where people are just taking a stroll, right? And so what we've seen is, even though in the last 10 years, there's been a tendency with clients to almost hyper program or hyper activate public spaces. So you get food trucks, and you get a farmer's market, and you get an art fair, and you get a this and a performance and a that. In fact, the photograph behind me, I'll duck away. This is Mike's photograph of a plaza in Cambridge near Harvard, where they hired us to design a plaza that would host a whole bunch of different activities. And we said, fine, that's great. But, you know, we also have to design it for what you're seeing behind me, just the everyday of people moving through the space, or people wanting to sit and just hang out and read and be quiet, you know, and it may be with a kid or a lover or a friend or just alone, right? And so for us, it's continuing to kind of think about those things, but it's also making us think about the importance of parks and large scale parks and linear parks as really critical public space infrastructure. And here's where I'm becoming an advocate as much as anything, saying, look, right now, parks are saving our sanity. in so many ways in cities. It's the one escape that typically is allowed for you to go to the city. You can walk, you can run, you can ride your bike, you can bring your dog. And while you can't have organized sports or participate in festivals, there's so much you can still do in these large spaces that allow you to spread out, or to have a long walk, or to have a leisurely stroll. And I think those aspects of the basic fundamentals of landscape is an important experience in the city are critical. And in fact, most critical, again, for populations that don't have access to these spaces. From where I live, I can be within 5 minutes in 2 or 3 different linear park systems and go for miles. But a kid in the center of Roxbury or Dorchester in Boston can't. And so while there's been an effort to build small spaces within lots of urban neighborhoods, I think we need to get back to investments in very large urban parks and park systems to give everybody access to the kind of amenities that some of us have access to.
Yeah. Chris, maybe this would be a good time to start to look at some stuff from the book.
Sure.
I don't want to get too far along. This hour is just moving right along. But so yeah, let's take a look, and you can kind of set up what the book is, where the idea came from, and the concept behind it a little bit as you walk through the images.
Yeah, let me pull that up. And I'll say that, Scott Mitchell, who's on this call, was very much one of the first people to really help me think through what the project was. Scott's now pursuing a PhD in landscape photography, or the history of landscape photography, at the University of Virginia. And we had talked from the start about finding a photographer that could really capture the everyday aspects of the places that we worked, and the lives and afterlives of the projects that we were able to execute. Scott had done a lot of research, and then I was perusing the New York Times one Sunday morning and found some work by Mike on Walmart parking lots in the South. And apparently you can camp out in Walmart parking lots. And Mike and a friend of his had done a series of these fantastic photographs on them, and that's what prompted the initial phone call. But for us, it was about finding a way to get inside this idea of how it is that we build our work on the foundation of what's already going on, and how our work may transform and set up new kinds of social lives and environmental dynamics within a place. So, we do landscapes like this, which are more expected, I suppose. University quadrangles, gardens, parks, the image on the right, all these images are Mike's. This is in Ann Arbor, Michigan. But in fact, the design project on the right in a lot of ways is situated within the broader regional landscape that you see pictured on the left. And yeah, occasionally when forced, Mike also does photographs of plant material as well. And so we're constantly toggling between the absolute detail of texture and color out to these really larger scale systems that begin to inform a place. At the other end of the work, we do city planning and urban design and large-scale public infrastructure like this on the waterfront in Green Bay. Fairly modest project, but one in which we were able to shape the buildings here, not design the buildings, but begin to set up the urban framework for what we're doing, as well as design the physical infrastructure of the place. And as you can see, this place is set up for everyday life. It's set up for special moments like the wedding that's happening out on the pier. And there's this very close relationship between the way in which we design the things that are within a space and then the social life that we hoped that those things will support going forward. And so, oftentimes this is very much within the context of the place that we work. So on the left, you see some of the industrial landscapes of Green Bay. And on the right, again, you see the way people are starting to inhabit the project, which still has this roughness, still has this rawness to it. It's simple materials. It is designed, but it's not overly designed for this place. And it's really there to feature the amazing river landscape and industrial landscape that it sits in front of. For me, though, it's always been about the way people improvise within urban fabrics. This is work in LA, and of course, skater culture, skateboard culture has always been part of, or for many years has been part of LA's culture. The way in which kids and people will appropriate pieces of infrastructure, places not intended for them, partly because there weren't public spaces for them, and partly because of this counterculture tendency that you see in LA. And so I've always been interested in the way people misbehave within public space, and the way in which, no matter what kind of landscape you present to them, they'll begin to improvise. And so we're very much interested in looking across the wide range of urban culture and the people and the communities that are there present in a place, and then how we respond to them, and even how we respond to some of the customs that are inherent on the ground. And I particularly love the very odd ways that vegetation is shaped within the city. And yet we're always toggling back out to the bigger picture of what does it mean to be a large city set within a landscape that doesn't have enough resources to support the people that are there. And how is it that we can begin to think through the connection between the work we do and these larger social and environmental forces that are in play in the places that we work, like in Galveston on the top. And on the other hand, the kind of social lives that are created from the kind of work that we do, with essentially a lot of the design elements like these benches simply there as prompts for people to appropriate and improvise to whatever end they might. And so the book is set up to look at 7 different cities across the US, LA very much at a very large scale, very much looking at the culture of LA, the highway culture of LA, the urban culture of LA, and also the flip side to some of the pressing social conditions and social issues that are in play today. With LA, the city built out of this really tough, hunky infrastructure that dominates so many of the city's landscapes, is something to contend with, but as I said before, something to play off of as well. And yet, as Mike was able to discover, even within the most engineered condition, you can find moments of incredible life, ecological life here in a particular part of the LA River, and even within these vast, expansive landscapes and hills and plains that just go on and on and on, these opportunities for incredibly intimate moments between people, or just moments that people are having with themselves within this broader city. And so it's this oscillation between that moment in time that a person is sharing with themselves or with somebody else, and some of these really large scale forces that in so many ways mark the work that we do.
Yeah, let's pause here for a minute and unshare And I want to, while we still have some time, I still have so many questions about. I feel like we kind of skimmed over that street work from Michelle, and I
Uh-huh.
have so many questions about that work that I'd like to get back to as well.
Okay.
So yeah, like one, for example, is just speaking to, you talked about that relationship between the public and private, and I've always, I think most people think of the private realm as more intimate than the public realm, but your work seems to challenge that a little bit. Can you speak to, the intimacy and vulnerability that you're looking for, or that you have to kind of find within yourself to create the work?
Sure. I guess like one obvious magical thing about New York City, well, I lived there for 15 years, was like the constant bumping up against people and the proximity of people. And that inevitably kind of like makes room for storytelling, whether it's like in your mind or it's unfolding in front of you. It's constant theater. And in LA, for example, a place that's more spread out, you have to kind of concoct that sort of intimacy. The weirdest thing is like when I moved here, I was so social in New York for so long, and I come from like Toronto, which is like another kind of a smaller city, um, and I got to LA, and I noticed that people were really awkward with communication. And I've been here 8 years now, and I've become really awkward. I think that there's like a practice that happens socially where you're just constantly talking to people or learning how to navigate public space, public relationships, And so here I am in LA, and I'm like trying to take that, like everything I know about New York, I guess, and space and intimacy and all of that great bumping together of everything, and I'm sort of forcing it on people here. And like my hope anyways is that when people look at the photos, that they feel close to these people and they have an opportunity. Like I have a kind of compulsive personality, and I love, whether it's like, and I could show some of my COVID stuff that I've been doing, but whether it's like a flower or like the texture of a building, or I like to get up close to things. And I have sort of built a practice for myself where I just literally follow my gaze. It's as simple as that. That's what's driving me. And if I'm walking along and like a color pulls me and I'm like, ooh, that's great. Well, at the end of the day, when I collect all these photos together, it tells me a lot about myself, and that's quite intimate. And I think that, yeah, the street is a vulnerable place. Like it's vulnerable. And I think like this like fight for privacy in public comes from fear, and it comes from that vulnerability. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people and a lot of companies and all kinds of things that kind of come to take advantage, I think, of the vulnerability of the street, making it very difficult for artists like me who just really want to celebrate. At least that's my intention. People can argue with me all they want, but my intention is to celebrate those things that we see when we walk around. Like it's very exciting, like with Chris, I have so many questions for you. Like I could talk to you for a long time, I think, but it would just be me throwing questions at you. I'm like so curious about like what it means to like direct people's feet. I play a lot of video games, and you have like many different styles of landscape in a video game. One is like a kind of game where like whether through the lighting of the game or whatever, they're definitely directing you. You get this kind of idea of freedom, but there is no freedom. There's only one way to go, and if you don't go, you come up against the computer's programming, like and then there's the new open world game where you can wander around. And I kind of think about this a lot when I'm on the street. It's like the freedom of just turning a corner and being somewhere else, and suddenly you're like exposed to something magical or horrible, or it changes you. When you start to direct that or navigate that wild space for people, it's a big responsibility. And like, yeah, I'm just curious, like I know I keep coming back at you with this stuff, but like
No,
You're
it's
like
actually,
mapping people's experiences in a way.
yeah, it's a good one because we're creating those experiences. In some ways, we're anticipating the way people will behave in certain ways. We're trying to design for that. In some places, we're trying to script some of what will happen in a place based on what a client may be asking, based on what we bring to the table, based on what kinds of foundations and other amenities we may put into a place that you can attach to. But we also have to acknowledge that people are going to use this in ways that we can't anticipate. And for us, that's freeing. That's saying, look, we can anticipate that people will have different moods, that they'll want to sit in different ways. I mean, just the design of the bench behind me is all about the fact that we all have different body types, and our ideal sitting situation is different, one body to the other, right? Just based on comfort level. But it also depends on our mood, right? And the time of day, and where the sun is, and who we're with, and the way in which we want to sit with that person. And so, if we have a bench that has one single profile, it's not acknowledging any of that, right? It's like the old school chair where everybody sits in the same way. We're quite interested in allowing a simple bench to accommodate people's bodies in different ways. And then all of a sudden things happen, right? So again, on the benches behind us, because there are two levels to the bench, all of a sudden we had a small kid sitting on the upper part and his mom sitting on the lower part, and they could talk eye to eye and have this different relationship to one another, right? That's not something we designed for, but it's something that came about because of the I would say the kind of looseness and open-endedness and acceptance of people's behavior, that they will improvise in ways, and they'll probably find better ways to use the things than we can anticipate. So for us, it's a little bit of anticipation. It's a little bit of designing for certain things, but also acknowledging that other things are going to happen, and that's good, right? And that just enriches the sense of that space. And the more and more that spaces can be designed for both of those things, right? For scripted moments and for unscripted moments, I think that's what will make for a better public space. A lot of that comes through observation of people and human behavior, right? And looking at the research that others have done. One of our first experimental projects was in a garden festival in Grand Métis, Quebec, which is way, way northeast up, way, it's cold, very cold there. But they have this great summer festival, and we just created this undulating rubber topography, right? Hills, out of the bouncy rubber from playgrounds, just to see how people would behave in it. And of course, kids would start to run and play games and bounce and jump and do all these other things. But then, we had the construction supervisor taking photographs all summer. He was absolutely fascinated, because usually the gardens that come out of these are stage sets, right? They're something, it's very sculptural or compositional, or it's meant to tell a story about the history of Canadian landscape or something, and with tubes and whatever, right? Ours was just all about interactivity. And so he was amazing, because he would photograph the way in which people used that space all over the course of the summer. We must have 300 photographs that document, these moments. He'd also encourage people to get in, take their shoes off so they could really feel the squishiness on their feet. And have that sensorial experience, and often just gave them a push to get going, because they didn't quite know what to do with the space, but they would start to improvise in a way. And it's partly the photography, partly the way in which human behavior occurred within that place that's really informed our thinking for some of these other projects that we're working on now.
Wow. It brings to mind a moment that I'll never forget in New York City. There's always these moments, but I went in the middle of the week, I was younger, to Socrates Sculpture Park, which is a park in Queens. I hope it's still around. I don't even know. And this was
it
like
is.
way back. This was like late 90s, early 2000s when I went. And I just went to walk around and, usually during the week it was empty. And these like 4 teenagers had like, they were young. They were like 15 or 16. They definitely kicked off of school and they went there and they laid out a blanket, and they, on the same blanket, the 2 coupled off and were making out. And it was like, it was such a good
Yeah.
special moment that like I don't even know if the curator of that park had envisioned that, but like what a great use of the space. It's so perfect.
No, perfect. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's the so many of those moments that you're capturing on the street or in those places, even though you're in a crowd of people, to have this really one-on-one intimate moment between a dad and a kid, or 2 people, right? I mean, that's what we strive for in the places that we design, right? If we have so over designed it that restricts people's ability to connect like that, then we've not done our job in a lot of ways.
How do you work in Rebellion? You said, I really like that you said that, because I'm curious, if I design a Rebellion, do you like put in like materials that can be broken, or like through, do you put like secret little areas that were like all kinds of nefarious things?
It depends. I mean, the garden I was talking about in Grand Marais, Quebec was called Safe Zone because we used all the safety materials from public landscapes. So we had subway tile to warn you before you went in. It was rubber and it was supposed to be safe, right? But the one thing we did that was a little insidious there was, because the topography was going up and down, there are codes that govern how thick the surface should be relative to somebody's fall. So the higher your fall, the thicker your surface, which meant at the top of a mound, the layer would be thinner, and at the bottom, it would be thicker. But what occurred then, if you started running over it, your resistance would change, and so the whole thing would cause you to fall into each other and into the mounds, right? So that's one way. Sometimes it's just pressing a point. I mean, at Harvard, we had to press so hard to get these benches, to get a nonconformist bench, right? And it wasn't the designers or the social historians that were part of the design committee. It was the administrators who were like, oh, I can't imagine that's going to happen. Why can't we just have simple benches and this, that, the other thing? And then the day they were unwrapped, I immediately got a photograph and a phone call, saying, Chris, oh my God, people are using these things just like you drew them. And that was like a 1.5 years worth of persistent effort trying to assure people that we knew what we were talking about. And so it's a range of things. Sometimes it's a hidden agenda that we don't talk about. Sometimes it's something that we just have to keep pushing and advocating for through the work.
I do feel like we need to pause for a second because we're at 8 o'clock. I feel like I have hours worth of things that I'd love to talk about with both of you guys.
Chris.
But and we can keep going for a little bit longer, but I want to open it up to, if anyone else has any questions, you could type them into the chat message, or you could also just unmute yourself and ask a question if you want. We just saw, I would love to see the cover work. COVID work. Yeah, exactly.
Oh.
I was thinking
yeah,
the same
sure.
thing. Yeah, let's go there.
It's for me, it's very different, and a little bit wait, what happened to it? Mm-hmm.
And as we're looking through this, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to type them in as we're going through.
Why are you not coming back?
I'm really curious here, because so many of the spaces that we've designed and so many urban spaces generally are empty right now or near empty.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, but I'm not even taking those photos. I'm taking close-up still. I can't get away from it. I'm like, I don't want to take photos of, so because I'm using this giant lens, generally, like I can't hold a flash like I normally would. Like it's completely like slowed me down. And it's made me like rethink. So instead, I'm just like really enjoying these like I live
That's
near
cool.
a very wealthy neighborhood. But I live in like the adjacent very working class bit of that Hollywood neighborhood. And so I like to go over to the other side and see how the better half live. And then photograph. This is much more my side of Hollywood. But yeah, well, what's happening, what's really interesting is my part of Hollywood is it's near Paramount, near Hollywood Forever Cemetery. It's kind of crossed by Vine, Santa Monica, Melrose, and I guess it would be Gower. It's a very working class neighborhood, but like when I moved into this particular neighborhood, I was so sure that it would never get gentrified ever. I was like, no way, this is not getting gentrified. It's totally getting gentrified because it's right in the center of the city, and people are coming and just tearing down lots. They're buying like 3 houses at a time, these companies, and just tearing them down and making these very boring block, like faux, like just cement blocks with like, I don't know, bad windows. I don't know. I hate them. And I literally, yeah, I'm watching a neighborhood in transition, and I'm part of it. I'm like a wave of white person that's moved in from New York, and to change it. And yeah, I'm just watching it unfold. It's like, but this is basically like, so instead of a hand or like a foot or a face, you get a bush or whatever. and like LA right now, it's in that special moment where like it's so lush and so vibrant, and people aren't really spending the money on gardeners, or like for health reasons they're not inviting gardeners. So it's like just the most wild, beautiful, unkempt gardens everywhere, like flowers overflowing, and everywhere you look it's just like lovely. So I go around with my giant lens and I just take photos of just stopping and smelling the roses, basically. It's definitely not my typical kind of thing, but I guess like the treatment of this as a subject is the same as I would.
It's funny, if you were just to present these images of vegetation and weeds and all that, you wouldn't guess that you're in the middle of the city, right?
Yeah.
Really
Look at this crazy thing.
That's amazing.
Yeah, this is
not
so
all of
epic.
it's tended. I love it.
Yeah, like I've become like really attuned to nature, just like, and this kind of city nature, this kind of nature where it's like, you know, like something like this, it's just so magical and majestic, and like I'm so grateful for it. I really hope that like people fight for more opportunities to walk and ride in LA, and less like and I understand that there's environmental issues where you can't water your lawns. We're about to go into another really bad drought because this winter was dry, and like yeah, I mean, that was just some of it, but
Great.
yeah, I don't know. It's just very meaningful to the city. The city's become much more soulful. It was always very soulful, and that's not the right word, but it's become more tender, soft, because that we're all just not in our cars. And the sky is so clear, like physically you feel the difference in the environment, and that it's just it's depressing that we're like so dead set on just destroying all these things that make life so enjoyable. It's like crazy. Yeah. So I guess it comes to people like you need to design the spaces that enable somebody like me, or to make people comfortable to have their photo taken. Like people are so stressed out when they're walking in the city now, they're just going from place to place, that like they don't want their photo taken. And for various other reasons, you know.
Yeah, it's
like,
interesting.
how do you get people relaxed?
Well, no, that's a big question. I was asking Mike that question, and Francis is asking that question on the chat too. Like, how do you approach people? How do you encourage the openness that's displayed in the work? Like, you know, do you talk to them before you photograph, or what's that process like?
Yeah, that's the number one question I always get. It's like so many different ways. Sometimes I'll just grab the photo and walk off. Sometimes I'll grab the photo and talk. Sometimes I'll talk in advance. It's like I've been doing this for like 20 years, like professionally for like 10 or whatever. I would say like really consistently for 10, I should say. So that it's become like this almost like an instinct for me, very internalized. I don't think too hard. I can just tell right away, is this person going to yell at me? Are they going to get violent? Are they going to be weird? Is this an uncomfortable moment for them? Is this the wrong moment to take this photo? All these things whiz through my mind very quickly. I'm very fast, and I assess, do I speak first? Do I just not get the photo? Do I sneak it? Sometimes when you sneak it, then it could get almost violent, and that slows me down and scares me and makes me not want to do it anymore. So it's all finding a balance, but I think like spaces make people happy or unhappy, and I'm a part of the space. They're just going about their day, and I like to think of myself as very rebellious, and that I'm getting people, I'm like injecting myself in a rebellious way into their day that might just be from A to B. I don't know, and it might be full of things. But I become one of them. Maybe it's a conversation at dinner, or this person took my photo today, or I look good today, I got my photo taken, or like this really annoying person came up to me, took my photo, and we got into a fight, and I can't believe they did this, and why is this allowed? And like, I just become part of somebody's fabric of their day in a really weird way. And it's as much they become part of me, because I'm only photographing them because I'm thinking of them. I'm interested in them. I'm not taking it for anybody else but myself. It literally is a walking journal. And I don't know if that answered that at all, but basically.
No, it does. Mike, can I show a couple of yours
Sure,
quickly?
Yeah.
Because one of the aspects of the book that's really interesting is even in some of Mike's work, we were having conversations, but then there are other parts. Obviously, the work is his, and then his own work on portraiture comes through very strongly, and was a key part of the book for us. We wanted to integrate that, and so two of the characters from Galveston, Texas, an island off the coast of Texas that we've been working with for a couple years. Kids in the street playing ball, really helping to emphasize that distinction between the very wealthy in Galveston and the very poor, and the different kinds of smaller groups of people that are at work in the street every day. There's also, and then this guy who's kind of sort of interacting with the stork or whatever this bird is right on the beach. So Mike's really great at capturing these things, but it's this one I wanted to ask you about, Mike. This is a guy in St. Louis. And so one of the things we're trying to do in St. Louis is really capture the racial divide within that city, the fact that there are advantaged communities that get investment and they're predominantly white, and there are disadvantaged communities that haven't seen investment in their neighborhoods. And it couldn't be more stark than it is in St. Louis. And how do you work within this environment, and what is it that we bring? And so on the one hand, we wanted to show the realities of St. Louis and the stark differences that are there. And I can occasionally also point to some of the hope and the joy that people do experience within their everyday lives. But in some ways, this particular image captures St. Louis so much for us, and is one of the, I would say, one or two most significant pieces within the entire book. And I've never actually asked you, Mike, how did you get this image of this guy?
Yeah, this one's really interesting to me too, because I think the expression is so ambiguous and people react to it in such different ways. I've had some people look at that image and really think it didn't do anything for them. and then other people who have reacted to it as one of the strongest images of the project. To me, it's a challenging image in a couple of different ways. It has my own role in the making of the image, and the way I see him looking at me as a person rather than the camera. It kind of illustrates this power dynamic. Me being above him, him looking up at me, and the expression to me is kind of this almost asking for help kind of a thing, which is a really uncomfortable thing for me to acknowledge as the photographer who made it. But the reality of that moment is that he was asking for help. I mean, he came up to me and asked for money, and I gave him like $1, and then talked to him for a minute, and then I asked if I could take a picture. And in the moment, this is one of those really interesting things. This came up last week when I was talking to photographer Matt Eich about how images kind of, in a way, almost lie sometimes, or sometimes they very much do. And in this case, if you look at the images before and after this one, they're really different. And this was just kind of this fleeting moment in a certain kind of expression where when I was shooting the images, I didn't think I kind of wrote them off instantly. Like I didn't think I had anything there. And it kind of took seeing this image as a standalone without looking at it with the other ones as context for me to look at that and say like, well, what would I see if I didn't know anything else and I just saw this image? And then I was like, whoa, this is kind of a powerful image. Yeah. So that's kind of my story behind that one.
That's good. I mean, his expression you can read in a number of ways. For me, there's as much longing in the image, as much weariness in the image, as there is that quality of asking for help. Although that I can see that there too. There's also this. I can't help but see this slight hopefulness.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I see that too. That's the complexity around it, is like he's trying to put on the face he's actually trying to make, and you can see it more in the other ones, in the other images, is like this bright smiling kind of a face. Yeah. And somehow in this brief moment, it switched over into something else. And because like the big eyes he's making is he's trying to make like a, smiling for the camera kind of a face, but it just had this momentary thing where it revealed something else too.
Yeah.
I want to, we have some great questions coming in. So let's jump to those real quick. Here's a couple quick and easy ones for Michelle. What equipment do you use? And that's from Pablo.
I'm not allowed to ask that.
Yeah. And from Lauren, are there some cities, or is there a city you've never been to that you would love to shoot in?
Oh yeah. Equipment, I'm a Sony. I have a couple bodies, a Sony a7R4 and a7R3, and I use various lenses. I use ProPhoto lights. On an editorial, I could use up to 3 or 4 lights, and then for my street work, I use a single flash. And lately I've fallen in love with the 70 to 200 millimeter telephoto lens, which I never thought I would. It's like a revelation for me. Yeah. And then what was the second question? Sorry.
A city that you've before we get to that, just a real quick follow-up on you loving the 7200. So is that something from this kind of using it out of necessity that
to come out
you might actually,
yeah. I mean, it's like you pair that lens with light and it's like, it's so beautiful. And there's still enough room in it. Like 70 is still pretty far back and 200 is pretty close. So it's quite a range, and it just flattens everything. And so I'm used to I go through all kinds of thoughts on artifice. I think like what I do is very artificial, and I'm obviously very much like, here I am, this is my style, I'm putting it on you. I think so. Like a wider lens will kind of like do funny things to your face.
Yeah.
And then, and there's something about the challenge of getting up close to people. This I have to be quite far back, and so it kind of precludes an intimacy that I need to take a photo sometimes. But that's
Mhm.
okay, because like the end result, which as I'm becoming more and more of a professional photographer, the end result is like however I achieve it is the most important goal almost
Mhm.
now. Um, the process was more important before, and the process will be important again. And the process is driving me crazy right now. But the end result of a 70 to 200 is remarkable, even on those plans.
Yeah.
And it's so it's just like a special. It like makes things special, like
Yeah.
touchable, chunky. I don't know, very textual.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay. And the
and
city
city,
question. Yeah.
city, there's so many places. I want to shoot all over Russia. My partner's Russian, so we're thinking about that a lot. From going to like smaller towns to bigger cities. So something like a Moscow. I actually get scared a little bit when I go to places, because like a lot of places are quite hostile to photography and they're not used to it.
Mhm.
Um, so I also have to think about like how conservative is a place, how open are the people, how kind are the people, are they going to look at me, who I like generally read as a queer person, and then it's like, you know, how are they going to treat me? Um, you know, do they like women with cameras? It's like there's so many questions you have to think about in a city, but like a dream, like I want to go back to Mexico City and Seoul. Those two places are so awesome for taking photos in. Seoul at night is so cool. Like people there are just really cool. And the city itself is really interesting, and there's lots of light out at night and stuff. Yeah, Mexico City is so vibrant, and they love color so much, and you see it in the design of the city. And there's so much beautiful design in Mexico City. And then yeah, there's lots of places within the, I mean, I haven't really explored the South enough. I would like to more. I don't
Come on
know.
down.
Yeah, I will. I have lots of friends in pockets now. It's like all kinds of places. You know, yeah, there's so many places,
Yeah.
like so many places. I'm very aware though as a photographer, and I don't know how you feel about this, Chris, but like imposing myself on a place, like I'm so aware of the politics of pulling out a camera somewhere. And I think about that a lot as well. Like, what does that mean? Who am I? Like, am I just going to insert myself somewhere?
Yeah.
Like how, if I do that, how will I be treated? How do I deserve to be treated? Like, what am I going to do with the images? Like,
Mm.
you know, all that good political stuff that goes into taking an image in public space. And
Yeah.
Yeah,
yeah,
we think about it in terms of if are there places we want to work in? Are there places we don't want to work in? Or under what terms do we want to work?
right,
Are there opportunities for us to put forward um, our own social and environmental values, even in different
right,
kinds of places? And that's not meant to impose what we firmly believe on somebody else and somebody else's culture, but we don't want to work for totalitarian regimes. We don't want to do work that um, where some of the basic social and environmental goals that we have can't somehow be embedded.
right,
Oftentimes that's not explicit in the work. We don't, you know, we don't necessarily talk about climate change when we work in China, but we do talk about flooding. But that's
right,
frankly no different than Texas,
Yeah.
right?
right,
It's the same politic in some ways.
right,
In other places, we've worked in Abu Dhabi and Dubai and can talk about climate change, sea level rise. And so, you know, in places like that, it's how can we get the best out of the resources we have and put forward an image that we feel good about, despite what um, you know, regardless really of what a client's agenda is.
uh-huh,
So we're careful in those ways, and sometimes have to have hard discussions about where we won't take work.
yeah.
Chris, we have a question from Nicole about the book. What's the intended audience / purpose? for the book?
Yeah, so it's really meant to go to a broader audience that's probably photography loving, design loving, culture loving, cities loving. But it's different in a lot of ways. I compare it to a typical monograph that an architect or a designer might put out there. It's not that at all. Those are typically self-funded monuments to yourself that celebrate yourself, and then put that work out to a bunch of your peers. In this book, I'm interested in capturing a broader set of conditions that are at play within American society today. Certainly, there are connections to international culture and society as well. But what are the conditions that we're finding in these 7 cities across the U.S.? How do they paint a picture of some of the challenges that we face today as people? Individually and as a collective culture, and in what ways are there opportunities then to respond to these conditions and embed that within design practice? And so the book is predominantly, what would you say, Mike, 3/4, 80, 85% even photographs compared to drawings that we've done of some of our projects. The drawing work is not intended to fully explain a project, nor are the photographs of the projects separated out. In fact, one of the things that I love about the way Mike worked and the way the book's organized is the few photographs that appear of our work are just embedded within the photographs of that city. And you may not know them if they're not called out for you. And I just kind of love that, the fact that that it's just kind of in the mix, if you will. But in that sense, we'll also have a series of very topical essays. I have a curator from LA writing a piece called On the Edge, looking at the relationship between the culture of a city like LA and its environment, but also interpreting the question of the edge in many ways, on the edge of a continent, on the edge of civil society, close to an international border, edges within the city, barriers within the city. I mean, she's going deep on a number of those issues. A social activist and artist in St. Louis, Dean Nichols, who's about 28, is writing a piece on social division within the city and the opportunities for activism and social life in a city like that. She herself is African American. I have a really nice piece being put together by Sarah Zodi, who's a landscape architect, again, young. She works out of Harlem. She has a practice. She's 28. She's African American. She is interviewing Ann Whiston Spurn, who's a landscape architect and a photographer, and is interviewing Ann about image and image making, and specifically doing a conversation about the images produced within the book and the relationship between photography and landscape architecture and public design in this way. And it's a really nice piece. I'm excited about it because Sarah's probably half a generation, maybe a generation younger than me. Anne is a generation older than me and was the chair of the landscape department at Penn when I started. And it's a really nice way to kind of triangulate a lot of the issues that are in play within the book. And there are a few others too. So, but it's really aimed at a more general audience. So it's not, there won't be design lingo in it. It's not solely focused at all on the work. It's about a broader set of issues. And, you know, one of the things I'm thinking about these days is capturing, you know, this incredible social life, the life that you're used to photographing, Michelle, right? And I can't quite tell right now whether it's going to be an ode to a life that's now not possible
Mm.
in certain ways, right? We always knew it sort of documented a particular moment in time, right? That time would change. We probably didn't, well, I know we didn't anticipate that it would change quite so drastically in the short term. And so it remains to be seen, like, how this book is viewed within the context that we now sit ourselves in.
Yeah.
Are you at all thinking of like the landscape of the screen more and more, Chris?
I am certainly looking at it a lot more.
Yeah. But like, who is it up to like people who like champion outdoor space to come and rethink and retool these screens that we're being forced to look at a lot more lately? Maybe it's like a small project. Do you think about that stuff?
We do. And in fact, at school, we're being asked, not just how do we change our teaching to accommodate the situation, but now that we're in the situation, how does that get us to rethink the way in which we teach? And we're starting to have that conversation in the office too. Like, what have we learned from being in this environment so frequently that might actually be useful or instructive to us as we move forward? And that can range from anything from how do you do public engagement on public projects virtually, and how are some of the issues of access to underserved populations actually exacerbated by the situation that we're in now, given that people often don't have access to Wi-Fi or computers or that sort of thing. So, those sets of issues. But we're also talking about, are there new platforms we can be using interactively online that might actually be a productive way forward as well? Those are open questions right now, I'd say.
That's interesting.
So guys, we're kind of past our time, and I want to be respectful for everyone's time. And you guys, if anyone needs to just kind of go, you're certainly that's okay. There's like 2 more questions that we have that if you guys are up for it, we could go through.
I'm good.
Okay. Well, first, Zach Whitman said he has a question for Michelle. So do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Hi, Zach.
Hey, Michelle. How are you?
Hello. I'm very good. Thank you.
Good. So I was just I was wondering, like your style is very distinct. I'm drawn to the Hype House photos that I saw a while back, and like before I even read the byline, like it's just so obvious that they're your photos and they have your fingerprints all over them. I'm kind of wondering, like, what was the process like of kind of like selling yourself and your very like distinct style as an editorial photographer, and like did you come up with any barricades or boundaries that you had to work against, or just what was that process like?
Well, it's like twofold. Basically, like I knew I'm not very good at compromising, and so it was either like, it worked or it didn't work. And if it didn't work, I came from another career. I would worm my way back into that particular career if I had to. And it all happened very organically. I actually I had never had an idea that I would be doing this as a career. And it's only until the last couple of years that it has been one. But basically, I like really put my heart and soul into my work and my street stuff. And I tried to get it shown as much as possible. Like a lot of blogs were showing it. And I was doing a few assignments here or there for like Toby Kaufman at Refinery 29 and Vice and stuff. And then I had a show. The Lucy Foundation gave me a little solo show in LA, and Toby Kaufman was in town, who's like a mentor of mine, and she brought some editors with her to come and see the show. And Anna Alexander, who I love dearly, she's the photo director at Wired, she was one of the editors, and she came, and it was like exactly what I kind of just showed you, like along those lines, not the same work, like a few years back now, but that style. And it was a lot of portraits and close-ups and details and stuff. And Anna really fell in love with the work, and then like a week later called me up or something like that, and she was like, what are you doing this summer? And then she hired me to shoot the whole 25th anniversary issue of Wired, 50 portraits, and we went around for like a month and a half, and she was like, do all the stuff that I saw in that gallery, can you do that to Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and all these scientists and people? And I said, yeah, I can do that. And like, I just did that, and that just proved to myself that it was possible to be the photographer that I want to be, and B, it could be compelling work. I hate when photography all looks the same, and I have a real problem with Instagram because of that. It's just so like flattening. And then like, yeah, and then other editors were like, I guess anyways, like, oh, I like Anna, she's, you know, pretty together, she makes good decisions. She chose Michelle to do this insane project, and it turned out really well, and she did it and came in on budget and everything. Well, let's hire her. And that kind of just, the floodgates opened, and now I feel very fortunate that I get to work with a lot of editors that allow me to do how I do. And you know, it's a balance too, because I can never be as wild as I want to be, because I'm still thinking of an audience, so I'm still telling a story, and I have to be responsible to the editor in the story. So that kind of sometimes like you know, it leads to compromise, so I've had to learn to do that. But for the most part, the really good editors choose the right people for the job, and they choose people that they like their look, and they're like, you know, you have a very specific style too that I really love, and so like people are choosing you for you, and that's kind of, it's a miracle. I don't know. Freaking miracle.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like the perfect storm kind of in a way.
Dream, yeah.
Right.
But you know, like I'm in my 40s, like it took a long time, a lot of shooting, a lot of preparation, a lot of like nobody calling me or looking at me. I think one thing is that like a lot of people didn't like Flash for a long time. Even in the street community, I would get crapped on all the time. And I think now it's had its renaissance moment. Like people love Flash now editorially, and it's like all over the place, and like, you know, so I guess it was just the right timing. I don't know. I hope I'm ready for when it like goes away, and then I just have to, you know, we'll see what happens. Maybe this time is teaching me not to use Flash, and to work without Flash, and different kinds of lenses, and think differently, and not have access to my usual subject matter, you know. That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks for
sorry, go ahead. I want to just, we'll do one last question. This is a great one to end on, I think, from Lydia C. Wilderness/tending is present in both of your work. I'm interested in the balance between composing/controlling versus wildness and encouraging lack of control.
Oh, I love that. That's such a good question to end on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I modify that a little tiny bit? Because I don't know if that was, I don't know if you guys can, hi. So like, you know, I guess what I mean in like the way that you're planning and composing an image compared to the way that you're planning and composing space. And I think, Michelle, as you were talking about, like to Chris earlier about like, how do you manage a space to direct someone's experience, and how much of that do you leave open for the wildness, and how much do you like pose your subjects? You know what I mean? I think y'all got it, but thank you.
I come from a filmmaking background. That's what I studied, and then I taught a film graduate school, and storytelling. I think that's such a good training, because like the whole secret to a great film is just like not telling a lot, so you enable like a sort of like connection that occurs between the viewer and the film, because they're trying to like figure stuff out and they're engaged, but at the same time it's very controlled on a very specific track. If you have those two things, for me anyways, melding together, you have a beautiful film. And that taught me so much about like, for me on the street, my compositions are so controlled. I'm like crazy about it. If there's even one thing off, then the photo is garbage. But at the same time, it has to feel alive. If it doesn't feel alive, then it's a wasted piece of garbage too, because this is a living person. And I'm so curious about that too. Like, that's why I keep asking you these questions. It's like how, like, I guess like Chris, like if you were given the opportunity to redo something in LA or bring something new to LA, like what would it be? Because this is a perfect city for composition, but also absolute wildness. And like those two things balanced together is such a beautiful thing, like such a perfect city for that.
Yeah.
The crazy.
And it's so much what's at the basis of landscape and landscape architecture. It's what makes it so different than architecture, right? I mean, an architect is designing a building and there's precision on every front. And the hope is that you're designing a building for 30 or 50 years that won't really change. Whereas in landscape, you know, we're planting stuff, right? That we can't control, that'll just grow on its own. That'll change growing in response to, you know, environmental conditions. So if there is drought or if there is inundation, something will change within that landscape. And so in a lot of ways, I think what we're, as designers, what we do is we organize, we script, we design with anticipation, all the while anticipating that something else will play itself out, and we can never fully control that, what it is that's playing out. And what's interesting for me is what you learn about ecology and landscape is absolutely applicable to humans and social life, right? It's that same sense of how you set up structure, organize systems, how you design in a way that prompts reaction out of people, but understanding that what you're doing is simply setting up a structure and a framework that you don't fully control, and others will begin to play off of over long periods of time. And so for me, that's the poetic of what we do, right? How do you find that right balance between something that is so precise and beautiful and refined and constructed, right? And then the stuff that'll happen as a result of that, whether it's water or plant growth or social life. And it's that dance that kind of keeps me going.
Yeah. I don't know what I was listening to recently, something about trees, about how like, you know, the old growth in Northern California, when a tree falls, it just doesn't die. It's not considered dead. It's considered to have a whole other life, to be a home to other things, to like, when I read that, I was just like, oh, yes, of course. Totally. And everything, Chris, you just said speaks to me of like the singular life. Like, how do you make your life good? You could just start to like take all those things, ideas, and pare them down to something so small as a single life. And then, you know, when we're all pushed up, I love this stuff. Like, I'm very grateful to speak to you, Chris. Like,
no, same here. This has been really wonderful,
like,
Michelle.
Yeah,
No, this has been great.
I think about public space a lot, and you know, and what it means to be in a city and to interact with the people, and being forced to stay indoors. It really gets you thinking about like the most important fabric of our life, which is interaction, which is society. And so, you know, you set the stage, and then I'm there to document it, I guess, or play with it.
Don't you just crave the moment where we can be back in these spaces and interact?
I do.
Yeah. We'll get there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. This has been really lovely.
You. Thanks,
you've been very generous with your time. And this was a great way to end it, to really kind of bring it back full circle to composition and how we're both, you know, working toward these similar ideas. Yeah. So thanks everyone for joining, and Michelle and Chris.
Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Thank you, everything. Really amazing. Thanks for hosting us. This is amazing.
Really cool. Yeah.
Great series.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. All right. Take care. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.
Take care, everybody.